And we're rolling.
Okay, great. All right, so why don't we begin? Laureen, why don't you introduce yourself and just say who you are, where you were born, and what year?
Yeah. Okay. My name is Laureen Nussbaum. I was not Laureen when I was born in Frankfurt in 1927, Frankfurt am Main in Germany. My name then was Hannelore Klein. I'm one of three sisters. I'm the middle one.
That's good. Why don't we try, let's do one more take of that, and maybe a short version of my name is Laureen Nussbaum. I was born Hannelore Klein in Frankfurt, Germany in the year you were. Let's try that.
Okay. The sound is okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
Sound great.
My name is Laureen Nussbaum. I was born in Frankfurt, Germany. At that time, my name was Hannelore Klein, one of three sisters. I was born in 1927. I don't know whether I mentioned that. And we lived in Frankfurt for 9 years, almost. In 1936, my family left Frankfurt for Amsterdam, where I grew up.
Can you tell us a little about your family, your father, your mother, your siblings?
My father was the financial expert of a large metal firm. He did all the banking and investing, I suppose. My mother was a stay-home mom, took care of the three of us. My older sister was 3 years older than I. My younger sister is 3 years younger, so I'm really smack in the middle. I remember the beginning of the Nazi times in Germany in 1933, when the SR marched through Frankfurt with the Hitler salute, and when the Stürmer, an awful weekly, was shown at all the newspaper stands. And I remember that even as a young child I was horrified at the caricatures they made of Jews in the Stürmer. We had to walk to school, and in bad weather we could take the streetcar, but normally we walked to school about 20 minutes. And in 1935, Jewish children were no longer allowed to go to school with the other children, because there was a rather large contingent of Jewish children in my elementary school, the Holzhausen Schule. They put us in a separate wing of the school, so we kept going to the same school, but a different entrance, and we were separated from the other kids. I was by that time a third grader, and I remember painfully that one of the girls that I used to walk to school with, a non-Jewish girl, would no longer walk to school with me. So even at this very young age, there were things that I was quite aware of. In 1930...
What other things were your memories and experiences of living under the Nazi regime?
Well, one of the things that fascinated me, and I'm a little ashamed of that, was those columns of Nazis marching through the street. And even now I could sing, I won't do it, most of their awful songs, Die Fahne hoch, and for instance, which was one of their songs. As a young kid, you memorize very easily, and I remember walking through the long corridor of our apartment with my father's cane over my shoulder and singing those songs. And of course my mother was horrified and said, no, you can't sing those songs. And that was the end of that one. At the end of 1935, beginning of 36, we children were quite aware of the fact that my parents were trying to get us out of Germany. Many of our friends had already left. And in April of 1936, when I was 8 years old, we moved, excuse me, sorry. We moved to Amsterdam. My parents had gone ahead and found a very nice apartment in a brand new neighborhood, the River Quarter, which had been completed at the beginning of the Great Depression, and those apartment buildings were standing empty because people couldn't afford the rent. I still remember, I don't know why, the rent was 75 guilders a month, which seems a pittance now, but it was too much for most people. Jewish refugees that left Germany as early as 1936 still could take some of their money, and so my parents could afford to live in that neighborhood, and so did hundreds of other families. So it was a very, how shall I say, congenial neighborhood where you heard in the beginning lots of German in the street by refugee people.
I'd like to focus still a little more on your memories of Germany before your family left, some of your family's experiences there, and also tell us about your family. So your family was Jewish, and what was your identity as a Jew, and describe your family makeup a little bit more and its identity as Jews.
My family was not really fully Jewish, and I was quite aware of that as a child. I loved to go with my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, to Mass, to Catholic Church. I really liked the incense, and I liked the singing there, and I was quite aware of the fact that, yes, my father was Jewish, and he liked to keep up the Jewish traditions. We had a menorah, we did Hanukkah, he could do a beautiful Seder. But my mother always went along, but it was not part of her background, and that was tangible even for me as a child. So quite often after my grandmother moved into the apartment below ours, in the same house, she owned the house, typically we would do Hanukkah upstairs and then go down and have Christmas downstairs. So there was this feeling of mixed background already in my childhood in Frankfurt. However, because my mother had adopted Judaism, we saw ourselves as a Jewish family, and we did go to Friday night services once in a while in the liberal synagogue, in the West End synagogue in Frankfurt, and I don't think we had any Jewish instruction in Frankfurt. I know in Amsterdam, but in Frankfurt I don't believe so. But we sang in the choir of the Jewish synagogue. We sang Judas Maccabeus, which is a Handel, of course. And I remember I can even sing a little bit of that still. So that was part of my background. We became a little bit more Jewish, in quotation marks, when we were marginalized, when we could no longer go to public school. I remember that we had a Jewish club where we danced hora, which we had never done before, and being pushed out of the mainstream, we tried to make the best of being in the sidelines. So that was all I remember of Frankfurt.
How did you feel about that with the fact that, so your mother was not Jewish, right? Not born Jewish.
My mother was really, if you go by blood, which the Nazis loved to do, she was half Jewish. But she was raised non-Jewish. She was not raised with her father. So actually, my mother was raised in a Protestant family in Dresden, because my grandmother was a professional singer and she was traveling all the time. So my mother spent her first 7 years of school from age 6 to 13 in Dresden in a Protestant family, where in Germany at the time you had religious education at school, so she went through Protestant religious education. And then my grandmother gave up singing and moved back to Austria. My grandmother was Austrian, and took my mother back to take care of her. And at that time in Vienna, I don't think my mother had any much religious background, but it was quite clear that her mother was Roman Catholic and the family of my grandmother was Roman Catholic. But in how much that impacted my mother, it's hard to tell. My mother and my grandmother both were very wide open for all kinds of religions. And I remember when my grandmother was an old woman in Amsterdam, she would once in a while go to church, to a close by Remonstrant church. Remonstrant was a rather liberal Protestant persuasion, and she had a Jewish prayer book under her arm. She just did whatever she wanted to do with regard to communicating with her God. She was not at all narrow-minded or bigoted or what have you.
And so your mother's mother
Yeah.
was Catholic. So by Jewish description, in the matrilineal bloodline, you would not be officially Jewish. How did your grandmother's family react to her marrying a Jewish man?
My grandmother was at least one of two sisters of the Austrian Catholic family who married Jews. Apparently that was perfectly fine. And I do not know anybody of my grandmother's family except of two cousins of my mother, but these cousins had a Jewish father. And so the Catholic branch of the family was not part of my direct daily life. I only heard about them, but I didn't really know them.
But I think I recall that the marital status of your grandmother was relevant when you got to the Netherlands, right?
Well, we about my grandmother and what her marital status meant to our survival, I think we'll get to that later on.
Okay.
Richard, just a minute.
Did you, as the persecution increased in Germany for being Jewish, did you embrace your Jewish identity, or did you feel like, why is this happening to me? You know, I don't have full Jewish blood. It's not fair. Did you try to actually see your way out of it?
In Germany, we were considered Jews because they went by the number of Jewish grandparents. But just like in the United States, a person who has one black grandfather is called black. So I mean, this is so prejudicial. That's awful. But we considered ourselves a Jewish family in Germany. Yes, and I noticed that we were marginalized, that we couldn't do things that we used to do, and my mother did not have many friends in Frankfurt. Just one very, very close friend, Alice Koppel, the mother of the rather well-known Ted Koppel. But otherwise, the friends were more my father's friends, and they were Jewish. And we did Sunday outings together and things like that. But otherwise, as to being more consciously Jewish, yes, as I mentioned before, we danced Torah and we sang Jewish songs, and we had the typical metal box to collect money for Eretz Israel. We had that, and so yes, we considered ourselves Jewish. There was no doubt about it. At that point, we did not differentiate and say, "Oh, we are only three-quarter Jewish." All of that came much later, really.
And you talked a little about how the Nazi legal and societal discrimination affected you not being able to go to the same school, and can you give any other examples of how that affected you and your family, or your memories of what was going on then in the early part of the 30s?
The only thing that I remember clearly had to do with swimming. I liked to swim as a child, and even now I swim. There was a special time in the big stadium in Frankfurt where Jews could swim. There was a Jewish sports society Schild, and I don't know whether we were members or whether we tagged on. I don't remember that, but we swam. When I say we, it's my older sister and I. At the stadium at a certain time, and our Sunday outings, as we were pushed out of the general population, were also with Jewish people. I remember swimming in the Neda, I think, was a little river, also with Jewish friends of my father's and their families. That's about all I remember. But then I was 8 years old, so I don't remember any details. I do remember gorgeous vacations in 1933 and 1934, but that was on my mother's side. This was at the house of her foster mother in Saxony, near the Czech border, and we were very welcome there and had a wonderful time. But I don't remember playing there with other children, or the Jewish thing there was of absolutely no importance as far as I remember.
And what about your older sister, your parents? How did the Nazi regulations and society impact them?
Well, for my older sister, she was 3 years older. She was almost 12 by the time we came to Holland. It was all much more difficult. Number one, high school in Germany starts in 5th grade. We didn't have a middle school. And she went to a Jewish high school. Why my parents or she decided that, I do not know. But I do know that I often played ball with her friends because I was always pretty good in ball playing, so they liked me to play along. And I remember how her friends, one by one, talked about, we are going to Latin America, we are going to South Africa, and in fact, my closest friend at school went to South Africa. This being pulled apart was very tangible, even at the age of 8, but I didn't experience it as painfully as my older sister, who was much more emotionally tied up with her friends, much more. So for her it was much harder to leave.
Were most of your friends Jewish, or did you have a mix of Jewish?
Well, the friends I'm talking about now, that would have been in 1935, and that's when we were already pulled out of the public school. So
why did your family decide to leave Germany?
My family decided to leave because the signs on the wall were clear enough that there was no future. And we were certainly not the first ones. The Frank family left in 1933, and as I said, even as we were playing ball outside, one girl and then another girl, they all said, well, this is my last time, we are leaving. These were pretty affluent middle-class people who could afford to leave, and so they did. And some of them had relatives abroad, some of them had other relations that helped them. So it was in the atmosphere. It was just in the air.
Did your family know the Frank family in Frankfurt?
My parents did know the Frank family. Yes, they knew. I don't.
Rephrase that one more.
The Frank family belonged to the same liberal Jewish community as my father did, or my family did. And I do not remember seeing the Frank girls in Frankfurt. I must have seen them, but I mean, there were so many kids. But my parents knew each other, knew the Franks, not very closely, but the way you know somebody in your own community. That was about it. Yeah.
How did you feel about your family's decision to leave Germany?
I thought it was a big adventure to leave Germany. Again, my older sister felt the pain of being torn away from her friends. I was fascinated by the idea that we would be close to the North Sea. I had one friend in the Jewish third class, 30 of elementary school, who had been to the beach at the North Sea, and she told us about it, and I thought, gee, that would be nice to be near the beach, and a new language sounded challenging, so I was the adventurous type, and I was looking forward to whatever excitement there would be gleaned from leaving Germany. My older sister, as I said, suffered greatly. My younger sister was 5, going on 6, so she didn't experience it all as consciously as the rest of us did.
Were you aware of the stress and maybe even pain that your parents may have been feeling at that time to leave their homeland and flee?
I was certainly aware at that time that it was difficult for my parents to decide what to take. we got the impression, and it was the correct impression, that our apartment in Amsterdam would be considerably smaller than our eight-room apartment in Frankfurt. We had a huge apartment, and so downsizing was one of the things that had to be done. My parents didn't want us underfoot while they were packing up. So the last week, my sisters and I were sent to I don't really know, in the summer it was a vacation camp, but during the year it was a place where children who couldn't be raised at home for one reason or another were kept, and we were sent there for a week while actually our apartment was being packed up. And then my parents went ahead, and my grandmother took the three of us from Frankfurt to Amsterdam when the time came for us to leave. And again, I remember the sense of adventure, and I remember Mrs. Copper coming to the station and wishing us goodbye. I remember the farewell present she gave me, a silver, not like a bracelet, but a ring to wear on the arm. So I remember that. But otherwise, no. Otherwise, I just remember the long train ride. I think it was 8 hours. It seemed very long at the time.
Was it difficult legally or administratively for your family to leave and go to the Netherlands?
It was, at that time, it was not too hard. It got harder in the following years, but in early 1936, we all had passports, and it was not too difficult to leave.
And did they consider going anywhere other than the Netherlands?
At that point, the Netherlands seemed an ideal place to go. Number one, the Netherlands were relatively hospitable. Number two, during World War I, the Netherlands were neutral, and so the hope was that we could sit it out, that Hitler would not last, and that before long we could return. This was sort of the leading thought.
This was seen as a temporary move.
Yeah, it was seen as, hence the word emigrant or immigrant was really a misnomer, but we were refugees for the duration. That would have been a better description. But we were always called immigrants and emigrants.
Did you?
There's like a clip. We're rolling.
You mentioned that you learned, I think there were some Zionist activities in Germany. Are you sang songs? Did your family ever consider trying to go to Palestine?
My family was not Zionist, not at all, no. And Palestine was never considered. We felt like Western Europeans in the first place, Jews in the second place, and not the other way around. And so, no, Palestine was a refuge for people who couldn't go anywhere else in our books, but it was not a place where my parents would have wanted to go. No.
Was America considered as an option?
Well, it was already pretty well known by 1936 that it was particularly difficult to get to the United States. But my father tried at the 11th hour to get us to is it Paraguay? Uruguay. He had a cousin in Uruguay. And so my father made overtures, and his cousin was willing to sponsor us. But it was too late. By the time the papers were about to be sent, the Germans occupied the Netherlands, and it was a totally new game.
What year was that?
That was May 1940. The Germans invaded the Netherlands.
Okay, when did your father consider going to Uruguay?
39-40, late. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so let's start to tell us about your arrival in Amsterdam and your life there, and let's go to the Amsterdam period.
Well, Amsterdam in the spring was nice. We came there in April of 1936. By that time, there had been enough refugee families that some enterprising teacher set up a program for children to learn Dutch as a second language. Mr. Reens was his name. And so my older sister and I were sent to that transition school, which was really located within the public schools right in our neighborhood. And with the idea that we, by September, when the new school year started in the Netherlands, in Germany, the school year at the time started at springtime after Easter vacation. So my older sister had finished sixth grade, yes, and I had finished third grade. And so we were hoping that by September we would continue where we had left off. Well, when September came around, and this is really a very crucial bit of history, when September came around, Mr. Reins, who liked his pupils to do well in the Dutch schools, advised that my parents put my sister into 5th grade instead of 7th grade, and me into 3rd grade. And my sister, being a good girl, didn't object, and I, being headstrong, did object. I said to my parents, "This is ridiculous." I caught up with both language and arithmetic with a boy who had been in 4th grade in Frankfurt with me, because we were in a mixed 3rd and 4th grade in Frankfurt, a Jewish class. And Lothar was going to be put into 4th grade, and why should I be put into 3rd grade? And my parents were law-abiding and a little timid, and they didn't speak the language well enough. They said they couldn't possibly go to the authorities and make my case. And I said, well, then I'll make my own case. So the first day of school, I cornered the principal, which was not at all as difficult as it might seem to be, because these schools had just the 6th grades, and one of the teachers was the principal. So I cornered Mr. Postumus, and I see her still standing on the landing between the 1st and the 2nd floor. And I said, "Mr. Postumus, I want to go to 4th grade." And he said, he was a tall man, and I was a little shrimp, and he looked down and, "What makes you think so?" And I told him, well, I caught up with Lothar, and Lothar is going to go to 4th grade, and as long as he goes to 4th grade, I can go to 4th grade. He said, well, I don't think I should do anything against Mr. Reins' advice, and why don't you start in 3rd grade, and if it's too easy, you can always move on to 4th grade. And I said, that doesn't make any sense. If I start in 4th grade and it's too hard, then it's easy to drop back into 3rd grade. But if I start in 3rd grade, then I will be more behind in 4th grade. And that was apparently superior logic. So I was put into 4th grade, and I was a better student than Lothar. He was in my class, and we did okay. My first report card was nothing to write home about, but it was okay. So that was, of course, a little triumph for me, but it was for my older sister, I think it was devastating. Because here was I, little over 3 years younger than she, and she was just 1 grade ahead of me, and so we shared friends, and she had lost all her status as the oldest one in the family. And my younger sister, who was little over 3 years younger than I, was all of a sudden the little one. It was the 2 big ones and the little one. So the whole family dynamics changed tremendously. It's, of course, in the scheme of big things, it's very unimportant, but in the microcosm of the family, it made all the difference, really. Quite dramatic.
And this school had a lot of German refugees, primarily?
We were in this school in the river quarter of Amsterdam. There were lots of German refugees. I don't think it was a majority, but I would say maybe up to 1/3 of a class would be composed of 1/4 to 1/3. But we learned the language fast, and we learned the games fast. I mean, kids learn so easily, so it was no problem, really.
So these German refugees were all Jewish, or mostly Jewish?
The German refugees were, I would say, 90% Jewish. There might be the occasional family that fled for political reasons, but they were a minority. Most of us were fled because they were Jewish.
So this school had a very large Jewish population?
Yeah, yes, there were lots of Jewish children. Not many Dutch Jews, but I can't even remember whether we had any in that particular elementary school, but certainly German refugees. Yes, I know one girl.
So let's talk about your life in Amsterdam before the war starts. from
Well,
36 to
life in
39.
Amsterdam was really wonderful for us. Of course, we had bicycles. We could go everywhere. There were no signs, Jews not permitted, Jews not wanted. I mean, we were just part of society, and our big aim was to pick up Dutch history, Dutch geography, and just blend in, which we succeeded in pretty well as young children. Particularly my younger sister, who only started school in September of 1936, so she had all her schooling in Dutch, and I learned it also very fast. One of the things that I always like to tell when I talk to younger people is that our family was very quickly democratized because we knew how to say things in Dutch. Our parents didn't know, so we told our parents, you can't say that. My mother picked up Dutch from the cleaning woman, which was not the Dutch that we learned at school. So we taught her what she can say and what she cannot say, which was very amusing and very empowering, and I really liked that very much.
Did you, or your friends mostly other German children, or did you have a lot of Dutch friends as well?
In fourth and fifth grade, my closest friend was a refugee girl from Hamburg, I think. But there were also kids in the neighborhood that we played with. We didn't really have many friends to whose house we came. Just one girl, yes, but otherwise we played a lot on the street. It was we had wide sidewalks, and we played jump rope and marbles and ball games all in the street, and that was a mixed group of all kinds of kids. And nobody asked about religion. That was just a private affair. One of the things I particularly liked in the Netherlands as different from Germany was if two kids got into a quarrel and started maybe even beating each other up, the mothers would come down and would take it up for their own kid and take the kid away, and but defend their own kid. In Germany, this was not the case. In Germany, if kids got into a quarrel, the parents wanted to disassociate themselves from their naughty children. It was very, very different. I liked the Dutch attitude much better. I thought it was much fairer.
How aware were you as a child of the situation and events going on in Germany at that time?
We knew quite well what was going on, despite the fact that we children were very happy in the Netherlands. We were very much aware of what was going on because a good friend of my father, very close friend of my father, was among the people who were rounded up during Kristallnacht, November 9th of 1938. And he was, I forget in which camp he was, whether it was Buchenwald or probably Buchenwald. And they had been working on their immigration, and after he was let go, they emigrated via Amsterdam to North America, to the United States. And I remember Karl Schwabe, the way he looked. I mean, the man had, in the 2.5 years we hadn't seen him, he had aged 2.5 decades. He looked that much older, so we were quite aware. Although he didn't talk to us children much about the details. I think he told my father, I would imagine he did. But it was obviously that he had gone through the ringer. I mean, it was just terrible. So yes, we were aware. We were aware of what was going on in Germany, definitely.
Any other memories of how you felt or events that you learned of or just related to, did you feel safe and separate, or was there any concern or fear that events would affect you in the Netherlands?
We like to think that the Netherlands would remain neutral whatever happens, because they remained neutral during World War I, and the Dutch government went out of their way to be even-handed. I mean, quite often there was indignation in the population about things that happened in Germany, but the Dutch were very careful not to give the Hitler regime any cause for discontent. So, yes, we had hoped that we would be okay. Of course, once Scandinavia was overrun by the Germans in April of 1940, then we felt less secure. But that was the time that my father tried to get us out, and I know Mr. Frank also tried to get the Frank family out, but by that time it was too late.
Let's take a quick break.
Sure.
Okay, move on.
Did you have relatives remaining behind in Germany that you were concerned about or heard from?
We had no close relatives in Germany. My father's two sisters went to France, which was only natural because my father was born in Metz, which at the time he was born was German. This is Alsace-Lorraine, which had belonged to Germany till from 1871 till World War I till 1914. So my two uncles, my father's older brothers, had stayed in France and were French citizens, and so the sisters who had married in Germany went to Strasbourg and Metz to their relatives, hoping to be safe there, which did not work out. A minute ago I thought of something that was important, and now it doesn't come back.
It comes back.
Yeah.
So you mentioned Otto Frank and the Frank family. Let's
Yeah.
talk about your acquaintance with the Franks.
Well, let me talk about what I thought I had
okay.
forgotten. We did have liberal Jewish education in Amsterdam. My older sister and I bicycled every Wednesday afternoon in the Netherlands. There was no public school Wednesday afternoons. That was when we had our Sunday school, but it wasn't on Sunday. So we went to the liberal Jewish religious education on bicycle. And Margot Frank, Anne's older sister, came along, and we often bicycled, the three of us. Margot, who was one grade ahead of me, hence in the same grade as my older sister. So my older sister Susie, Margot, and I would bicycle together to religious education. The liberal Jewish community in Amsterdam was actually organized and instituted by refugees, because in Amsterdam there was no such thing. People were either Orthodox Jewish or Portuguese Jewish, or they didn't have a religion. When we came to Amsterdam, I remember these numbers because they are so fascinating. 30% of the population was Protestant, 30% was Roman Catholic, 30% wrote down no religion, and 10% were Jewish. Kind of interesting mixture. So but the German Jews brought the idea of liberal Judaism, which of course exists in the United States too, but did not exist in the Netherlands. And Mr. Frank and also my father were rather active in getting this off the ground.
And did you continue to observe Jewish holidays at home, or?
My father did beautiful Seders, and we all loved the Passover. He did, and so I treasure that, and I could say the Man Staro very well. I still can do it now, I think, but eventually my younger sister took over, obviously. We did Hanukkah, I think, most of the time, but we definitely always did Christmas, because that was something of my mother's background. And when my grandmother moved from Frankfurt to Amsterdam, early 1938, we would do Christmas at her place. Yes, we did Hanukkah at our place and Christmas at her place. She lived around the corner from us in the same block, so she was close by.
How about your father's mother or father's parents?
My father's mother stayed with her oldest daughter at that point in Strasbourg. My father's father had died in 1927, my mother's father in 1928, so we didn't have any grandfathers. We only had grandmothers. And when the time came that Jews were being rounded up in France, mercifully my grandmother, paternal grandmother, just died before at the age of 89 and a half. But her two daughters, my father's sisters, ended up in concentration camp. We didn't know the details, but we knew that they had been rounded up. Whereas my father's brothers, who were French by nationality, were not rounded up. in France, at least in my family, there's a clean cut between those who were French Jews and those who were refugee Jews. The French all survived, all of them, and the refugees, none of them.
So tell us now about your friendship and relationship with the Frank family in Amsterdam before the war.
I mentioned that Margot Frank and I, and my sister and I, went together to the religious education, the religious classes on Wednesday afternoon. That was about all, really, at that point, before the war broke out. This was really all. And we saw each other at Jewish holidays in the in the liberal synagogue, and Mrs. Frank was always very active on holidays like Simchas Torah. She would organize a little walk around the kids with little flags and so on. She would be an organizer. My mother never went into those things. She was not interested, really. And my father never prevailed upon her. They just had a very agreeable relationship. That was the way it was. And we didn't think anything of it. So I did not really know the Frank girls particularly well till the war broke out. But by that time, 1940, I already knew my future husband. Of course, I didn't know he would be my future husband, Rudi, whose father had a little drugstore around the corner, again in the same block. And since I had abundant energy, I offered to take whatever deliveries he had on my bicycle and deliver to different people in the neighborhood. So I got to know his clientele very well, and the Franks were among his clientele. So I remember delivering whatever they needed, not necessarily all medication, because this was a drugstore, so there was also staples like rice and flour and so packaged, and I would deliver that. So I knew exactly where the Franks lived and was in their house. But I did not have any particularly close relationship to the Frank girls, except the bicycling with Margot, which I always enjoyed because I liked her very much. The closer relationship only came after the German occupation, when Mr. Frank and my father and other families tried to help, refugees that didn't have an income. And there was this German journalist, Anneliese Schütz, who eventually would translate Anne's diary into German. She did the first translation. She had no income, so the parents organized I think twice a month, I'm not sure, evening where Anneliese Schütz would read the German classics with the older children, Lessing, Nathan der Weise, and Schiller's Don Carlos, and Goethe's Egmont, and so on. And I was considered to be too young to be part of that group. But whenever they met at our house, I was allowed to sit in. So that's where Margot was, and Rudi, my then boyfriend, was part of it, my older sister, of course, and lots of other refugee teenagers, most of them between 15 and 20. I was the youngest one. But that's when I learned to appreciate Margot particularly well, because she was so mature and so well composed, and I always admired her for these qualities. And then, as the same exclusionary degrees were promulgated in the Netherlands, and so we couldn't go to museums and concerts and opera and the beaches and all this total exclusion that we already had gone through in Germany, and more so, then the families tried to keep their cultural hunger satisfied by organizing home concerts, chamber music. My mother was a fine pianist and had a lovely voice. Rudi's father played the violin, Rudi played the piano. So we had lots of chamber music. And at that point, I had the grandiose idea that I had brought a play from Germany, which we had done in third grade, at the end of third grade. It was really a Purim play, which we had done, and I had a book, and I suggested to Anneliese Schütz we do that with the younger children to entertain the parents and the older siblings. And that's when Anne played a leading role in the play, and Anneliese Schütz was nominally in charge, but I was the stage director because I had bought the book. So that's when I saw Anne regularly and marveled at her quick wit, and also was annoyed at her rather lively, talkative personality. I was lively myself, so I was particularly sensitive to liveliness in others, So,
can you tell that story again in kind of a soundbite version about how you directed a play with Anne Frank in it?
Yes, so the play was called The Princess with the Nose, and it was a Jewish play which we did December 1941 with Anneliese Schütz in charge and me being the stage director. It was done in our apartment because my mother was always extremely generous in making people welcome and helping others. So we used a velvet curtain between the living room where the audience sat and the dining room where the stage was, and we played this play, The Princess with the Nose. And I am not 100% sure, but 90% sure that Anne was the princess. She could have been the queen, but I think she was the princess. And we rehearsed, and we played it.
Can you say her full name, so that because you haven't referred to Anne Frank yet in this entire interview.
This was done by the younger children, mainly my younger sister's age mates. So 1941, they would have been 11. But Anne Frank and Sanne Lederman, who were a year older, also were in the play. And I'm not entirely sure, but I think that Anne Frank was the princess and Sanne Lederman was the queen. And we did the play twice because our living room was not big enough to accommodate the audience. So parents, siblings, friends were all welcome. It was, of course, in German, which was already becoming a foreign language to my sister and to Anne and their contemporaries. We older children who had learned to read and write in German had a much better basis, of course, than the toddlers and kindergartners. But anyway, this was when I saw Anne regularly for a short period of time. And we always, all of us loved Mr. Frank. He was just an outstanding daddy and much admired by all of us, because on Sunday morning he brought breakfast to his wife's bedside, which is unheard of in our circles. The women were in charge of food and the men brought in the income, and this kind of gentlemanly service was something unbelievable. So that's what I remember very strongly.
Let's take it again.
Sure. And what? Tell us about your memories of directing Anne Frank in the play and what she was like.
Well, I don't remember anything in particular directing Anne Frank. I knew the play by heart, and so I knew everybody's role, and I would whisper the text if somebody forgot. I don't think that she needed any extra prompting because she was lively and very well able to fulfill whatever she had to do. I remember people who were less gifted, who had minor roles, who needed much more prompting than Anne did. She certainly didn't need any prompting.
What kind of girl was she?
Anne was a very lively girl, and I think the liveliness is what stood out, really. Not only in the play, but also on the way to school. I'm not really jumping ahead here, because as of the fall of 1941, we had a repeat performance of what happened in Germany. Again, the Jewish children could no longer go to public school. We had to go to separate schools. And the Frank girls went to the Jewish Lyceum, and my older sister and I went to another Jewish high school. But we needed to use the same streetcar to get there. We lived at the very terminal of the streetcar line, and the Frank girls lived 2 stops in. And I remember very distinctly Anne standing in the middle of lots of kids around her, and she was holding forth. She was always holding forth and other kids around, whereas Margot was always quiet and composed. So I remember that quite well. Didn't last, because after a while we were not allowed to use the streetcar anymore. We had to walk to school, which was 3/4 of an hour walk each way. So that was quite different.
What was your opinion of Anne?
As I said before, Anne was 2 years younger than I. You don't think very long about kids that are 2 years younger than you are. She was lively. And sometimes I wish she would shut up. She was just simply lively, bright. But I was much more interested in Margot, because Margot was a lady, and I definitely was not a lady. I was a tomboy, so I liked to pattern myself after Margot. Certainly not after Anne. I didn't have anything to learn from Anne at that point.
Would you say that Margot was a friend of yours?
Well, she was not a close friend, but Margot was not a close friend of mine, no. Why should she? Again, she had her own friends, 1 grade ahead of mine, but we did things together, like going to the religious education and then the reading of the German classics, so we knew each other, but I guess maybe this is very European. We made a difference between friends and acquaintances, so we were certainly acquaintances. I wouldn't call Margot a friend. Nor Anne. We would say we were well acquainted, but not friends in that sense.
So the Nazis invaded the Netherlands in May of 1940.
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk about that and how that impacted your family
Well, maybe I should backtrack a little bit and talk about the beginning of the war, 1939. My older sister and I visited with the relatives in Metz and Strasbourg with my grandmother and the aunts and uncles. While my father went on a business trip, he no longer was a financial expert. He was now trying to sell notions wholesale to stores in the Middle East and in South Africa, Woolworths and other stores. So he was a traveling salesman, if you want to put it that way. And on his trip, 1939, he went via Metz and Strasbourg to see his siblings and his mother, and dropped my sister and me off in Strasbourg. And he went on his trip. My mother, in the meantime, flew to England. No, didn't fly. Took a boat to England to visit with her best friend, Alice Koppel. And my younger sister was farmed out to a neighbor family and stayed with them. And then there were horrible sounds of war being imminent, and I see the French troops training in Metz and Strasbourg and saying, "À Berlin! À Berlin!" And they were really ready to beat the crap out of the Germans. And so we quickly all reconvened in the Netherlands and made it in late July, early August, before the war broke out. Yeah, it must have been August by that time. So that was summer of 1940. Summer of 1939, I'm sorry. The fall and winter of 1939, 1940, of course, the Netherlands there was no war. I remember that we were collecting all kinds of good things for Finland, because Finland had been overrun by the Soviet Union, and there was great sympathy for the Finns, but we still felt relatively safe. And then in May of 1940, the Germans overran the Netherlands, and within 5 days the Dutch capitulated. The Queen fled, and which was important because the Danish king did not flee and the Belgian king didn't flee either, but our Queen fled and took all the whole cabinet along. After the Germans had installed themselves in the Netherlands in the summer of 1940, they first made sounds like they were not going to interfere with the Dutch way of life, and as long as we were not sabotaging their efforts, people could live a comfortable life and everything would be fine. Haha. It didn't last because already after a few months they started excluding civil servants and then went through all the measures that we were familiar with, things that had happened in Germany. And so by the summer of 1941, we were told that we couldn't go to public school anymore, we had to go to Jewish school. So then by that time the segregation was already in full swing. And then it took less than a year to start the deportations. By the spring of 1942, there was already practically total exclusion. May of 1942, we had to start wearing a yellow star, which we had to stitch on our garments. And in July 1942, that's well known from Anne's diary, the first calls came for refugee young people ages 15 to 45, I think, to report for a labor camp in Germany. Well, we very soon found out that it wasn't labor camp, but they were just being deported, and from then on, there was one thing after another. It went extremely fast from July 1942 till the end of the year. I think more than 40,000 Jews had been deported from the Netherlands.
How did you hear rumors or information about what was happening to Jews?
Well, this was our life. I mean, the rumors were not rumors. We went to school one day and we were 15 students, and the next day we were 10 in the class. And of the 5 who did not appear in school, maybe 4 were rounded up and deported, and 1 went into hiding. We never quite knew who went into hiding and who did not. We did not know that the Frank family had gone into hiding because we had been fed the story that they had made it across the Swiss border, and it was not very likely, but it wasn't totally impossible because Mr. Frank had been an officer in the German army, and he might have had officer friends, and not all Germans were Nazis, so he could have, it could have been that they had made it across the French-Swiss border, but they were in hiding. And in my school, well, the first year, 1941-42, in the Jewish school, was still relatively normal, but starting in the fall of 1942, it was a dismal experience because by that time Jews had been rounded up by the tens of thousands, and you never knew the next day what was going to happen.
But you said you knew that they weren't being deported to Germany, that they were being deported to other places. How did you know that?
We did not know what happened after people left the transition camp Westerbork. They were being transported east, and we never heard of anymore. The original ploy was that it would be younger people who would have to do forced labor, which had a certain plausibility. Once they started picking up whole families with babies and grandmothers, that story didn't wash, because these were people clearly who were no material for forced labor. So we knew that something much more sinister was going on, without knowing the details. We did not know about the death camps, but relocating people by the tens of thousands and never to hear of them anymore is spooky, to put it mildly.
Do you remember when you first saw Nazi soldiers on the streets of Amsterdam?
Well, yes, the German army occupied the Netherlands in May of 1940, and they were all over. And in the beginning, the soldiers behaved pretty decently because they had been told that the Netherlands was scheduled to become part of the German Reich. These were Aryans, these were their brethren, and so they better make a good impression and behave well. And the soldiers, by and large, did. One has to make a difference, I think, between the regular soldiers, conscripts, and SA and SS, who were the fanatics and the ideologues. They, of course, were a different kettle of fish.
Can you tell us what it felt like as a child to have to wear the yellow star?
wearing the yellow star was, I think, rather humiliating. On the other hand, it had at least one good feature. My father quite often came home with good news from the BBC. People had to repetitiously listen to the BBC, which was, of course, not allowed. And they knew that if they had any good news to tell, they better tell a Jewish person because it might buoy them up. So he brought the good news, which was endearing and helpful. But otherwise, no, you really felt marked, which is exactly what the intention was. And it was not so much that our Dutch neighbors took any negative view of us, but it was that you were so limited. You couldn't ride any public transportation. You couldn't go to a store except between 3 and 5 o'clock or whatever the times were. You were totally pushed aside, and you were no longer part of the general population.
Sure.
Nazism never took hold in the Netherlands. We did have a Nazi party, NSB, National Socialist Society or whatever. But even when Hitler was still successful and the German Reich was expanding successfully in all directions, they never had more than 5% of the population. So it was not, Nazis were definitely not popular in the Netherlands. However, you never quite know if one in 20 people is a Nazi. You don't know which one it is, so we had to be very, very careful. Another thing is how many people helped the Jews because of the story of Anne Frank and other people who were given shelter. The Dutch got an excellent name in being so helpful. Well, I think historical research has shown that it wasn't quite as ideal as it first seemed. However, one has to allow that Dutch apartments and houses are very small and built very lightly with wooden steps so that if you have somebody hiding, that person has to hide 100%. It's very easy to detect people. And because of the fact that the apartments were so small, very few people had a spare room. And if they had a spare room and a new baby arrived, or a grandmother had to be taken in because she couldn't take care of herself anymore, then of course the people who were hiding were asked to make room. And when people were asked to make room, and even if they found another hiding address, that was the place where very often people were caught relocating because they were so nervous and so pale from being inside all the time that they betrayed themselves quite often. The amount of betrayals in the Netherlands, I haven't seen any statistics. There were certainly some people who betrayed Jews because they got some money for it. But that was, I don't think, the main cause of people being caught. But I do know the final numbers that 25,000 Jews had been in hiding, and about 10,000 of them, which is 40%, have been caught one way or the other. Usually in transit, sometimes because they themselves were not careful, stood too close to the window, for all kinds of reasons. But not nearly all of them by betrayal. That's definitely the case. By and large, the Dutch hated being occupied by the Germans, and they shared this hatred with the Jews. So, the enemies, if you have common enemies, that makes friendships, obviously.
All right, let's go back to the Frank family now, and if you could tell again maybe the story that you told when you spoke here in Seattle or when you spoke down in Corvallis, kind of give the and if you repeat some parts that you've already told us today, that's fine. But just recount your relationship with the Frank family, and especially that time period before they went into hiding.
Well, the Frank family, like my family, belonged to the same liberal Jewish contingent that lived in the south of Amsterdam, in the river quarters mainly, but also in what's called the Beethoven quarters, which was a little bit more expensive. And families knew each other. My parents definitely knew the Frank family, and I always suspected, but I don't know it for sure, that Mr. Frank, who after all came to the Netherlands 2.5 years before my family, could help my father set up a business, and I'm sure he did. He was the most kindly, helpful person you could imagine. Otherwise, we were not particularly close to the Frank girls because they went to different schools. Margot went to a different neighborhood school to finish her elementary years. Anne went to the Montessori school, which was in our block where we lived. We could look down on their play yard. But I don't remember doing anything together except for the religious education that Margot and my older sister and I partook of, and that was Wednesday afternoons when we bicycled about 10-15 minutes to a school where these religious classes were being held. Otherwise, I do not remember having any specifically close relationship with the Frank girls till the year 1941, when Anneliese Schütz had this reading group where German refugee teenagers were reading the German classics. I'm not quite sure in my mind how this mix came to be, but it was in part because Mr. Frank and my father and other fathers and mothers wanted to support Anneliese Schütz so that she didn't have to go begging but had a little bit of an income. Partly it was, I'm sure, that they wanted their teenage children to get some of the German classics. German Jewish bourgeoisie was very well educated, and that was really very much part of them, Goethe, Schiller, Lessing, and so on, and they wanted their children to get some of the literature that was written by these people. So that was the other part, and it also in a way reinforces my idea that people thought that eventually after Hitler they might be able and willing to go back and resume life in Germany. So I think that's how all of this fits together. In those play reading sessions, I was really deemed too young to participate. 1941, I was not yet 14, but I was always interested in literature, and so when the group met at our house, I was allowed to sit in. So I read my German classics along with the older kids and enjoyed it greatly, and was rather open for what they had to say. But it was in this group where there were actually more boys than girls, I think, that I particularly admired Margot for her composure and the way she conducted herself. And I always thought, well, I really would like to be like Margot. How to do that? Anne did not come into my closer circle than the fall of 1941, when we did this play that I already mentioned, The Princess with the Nose, and that's when I got to do things with her and got to know her better. I had, of course, no idea that she was writing a diary. I had no idea that she wanted to be a writer. All of these things were not part of our conversation. Definitely not.
So your families occasionally did some holidays together, like you mentioned Simchat Torah with Mrs. Frank. You did the play with them. You rode on the bus to school with them.
We rode a streetcar together with the Frank girls, yes. No, we did not do holidays together. The celebrations I talked about were at the synagogue, Simchat Torah, for instance. We did the typical way of visiting in the Netherlands is very different from the United States. People came for a cup of tea, either in the afternoon or in the evening. A cup of tea and a cookie and talking. Inviting people for meals was not done, partly because people lived close, there was no reason to. And also apartments were typically rather small, so to accommodate more than 6 people around the table was pretty difficult. So that was not the start of entertainment. The start of entertainment was for a cup of tea, or in the morning at 11 o'clock, a cup of coffee, and cookies and conversation. That was entertaining.
So let's go back to 1941, 1942 now, when Jews are starting to be deported, friends are disappearing from school. Tell us more about that, and specifically about your parents and what your family's response and decisions were.
Well, once we, 1942, maybe I should backtrack because it might not be known that there was a decree in January of 1941 that all Jews had to register. You had to register how many Jewish grandparents you had. What constituted a Jewish grandparent? A person who was a member of the Jewish church community. That was all defined by law. So we were all registered. When the exclusion of the Jews started, and also, of course, we had the one big razzia, we called it razzia, which is an Arab word, really, a pickup of people, roundup of people, in February of 1942, after the big strike. That's a piece of Dutch history that makes everybody proud that Amsterdam.
Tell a little about this. What is the Dutch strike?
Well, there was an altercation between some Jewish youngsters and some Nazis. And Jews in the Jewish quarter, which was not a ghetto but a concentration of Jewish people, were being picked up and harassed and mistreated. And then the Amsterdam streetcar drivers and all large dock workers and large groups of people went on strikes all over, really called by the communists, which was a small party but an active party. And at that point, you really had the Dutch pitted against the occupiers. So that was the beginning. And at that point also a large number of Jews were rounded up and sent to Mauthausen and killed. And there was another, this is 1941. And then in June of 1941, there was another big roundup, a very, very clever and mean one. There had been a learning farm out in the countryside for young refugee Jews to learn how to farm and then eventually to go to Palestine. And that farm was closed by the occupiers, and in June of 1941, the Jewish Council, which was constituted after the February strike, was asked to give the names and addresses of all the people that had been in the teaching farm. The German authorities were going to open the farm again, and the young people were going to be told they could go back. What it really was a ruse, because they picked up all those young people. They thought, probably rightly so, young male Jews without families might be the ones that might not take all the measures lying down, and they just wanted to be sure to have them out of the way. So another few hundreds of young Jews, mostly maybe all of them male, I think all of them male, were rounded up early June of 1941. So by that time, we knew that it was going to be terrible.
So you were aware of this at the time?
Of course we were. My Rolf, our best friend, was one of them. So of course we were, sure. And so when there were more and more measures, we had to go to Jewish schools and other exclusionary measures. Then the Franks started looking for a hiding place, and my family started to look into our papers. And my mother had truthfully filled out that she had two Jewish grandparents on her father's side, and two non-Jewish grandparents on her mother's side. But now comes the story of my mother. my grandmother, who had been a professional singer, had this relationship with a Jew, Mr. Blumenthal. The mother of this Jew did not allow her son to marry a non-Jewish wife. Hooray for bigotry! Because my grandparents did not get married. My mother was raised as a child born out of wedlock in a foster family. My grandmother, who was very proud, kept singing, although the contact with my mother's father was always there. They spent summer vacations together. But my grandmother was not about to hold out her hand for any kind of child support, so she took care of things herself. And my mother was raised in this Protestant family in Dresden, and then at her mother's in Vienna. And my grandparents waited till my grandfather's mother died, and then got married when my mother was 19 or just 20. And so that, of course, was a beautiful loophole, because it was very hard to prove that Mr. Blumenthal was really my mother's father, although he had, at the time he married my grandmother, he had recognized the daughter as his daughter, but that could have been a politeness or kindness. So that was the case that a good Dutch lawyer made, that it was really that my mother was not Jewish at all. Hence, my sisters and I were half Jewish, and hence we should be able to be unregistered and take off the star and live a normal life. And this is what eventually happened, grace to the fact that there was a German lawyer in charge of adjudicating all those doubtful cases. And Mr. Karl was his name, Hans Karl from Osnabrück. And he decided that it was quite a clear-cut case. The mother of Mrs. Klein was not Jewish. That she married a Jew 20 years later had nothing much to do with the daughter. The daughter was not Jewish. Because this was not just kindness of him, but he had made it a principle that his office would have to prove that the father was Jewish, which was, of course, very difficult. Whereas in Germany and in other parallel circumstances, the petitioner had to prove that he or she was not Jewish. But the fact that he took it upon himself that his office would have to prove that there was fraud going on, that made it, of course, possible. That's the one leg of the thing. The other leg is that there is a Dutch law, which I wasn't aware of at the time, that says that children cannot be made responsible for their religion because they get it from their parents. And so Mr. Karl decided that half-Jewish children cannot be declared Jewish. That's up to them when they are adults. Hence, although we tried to prove that we never had any Jewish education, that wasn't even necessary in his book. The petition, my parents started the petition in the spring of 1942. In July of 1942, when the first calls came for typically refugee people, I mentioned that before, ages 15 to 45, when Margot got her call, my sister also got a call to report for labor, but then our case was already pending. And because our case was pending, my sister was deferred. She didn't have to show up. And eventually it still took till January of 1943 till we could take off the star and lead a more normal life. And these years in school, in the Jewish school, from September to January, that's impossible to convey. I already mentioned you started out with maybe 15 students in the class. The next day there were 10. The next day there were 7. My older sister, who was in 11th grade, I was in 10th grade at that point, ended up being the only student left in her class. I remember the chemistry teacher coming to me, I was always good in chemistry, and saying, "What can we do about your sister? She doesn't do her homework." And I said, "Can you blame her?" And of course for the teachers it was agonizing, because they had a deferment as long as there were schools, as long as they were needed. The moment the schools would be closed, they would be on the next list. So the atmosphere in that school was something else. And yet we learned French irregular verbs and chemistry formulas and all the things one has to learn. It was just two realities that went parallel that really didn't mesh together at all.
Tell that story again, because that kind of was in passing. You glossed over
okay. When the first calls came in July of 1942 to report for labor, I think it was July the 5th, the call went out to 7,000 people ages 15 to 45, and they were, as far as I remember, all refugees. The Germans were very clever. They knew that the refugees did not have a support system. We were newcomers. We didn't have, friends and relatives all over the country. So we were much more vulnerable. So let's get rid of those people first, and then we can see about the rest. So Margot got a call, and my older sister got a call, and several of my classmates got a call. I see us still standing, at that time we still had bicycles, at the street corner. I know exactly the street corner. And one young man who was in my class said, I got a call, and my mother wants to hide me. I'll be darned if I live in a closet. I'm strong, I can do work, I go, period. And there was another girl in this case who was really crying, said, I wish my mother would want to hide me, but they don't. They don't want to even hear of it because they're afraid that if I go into hiding and don't show up, then the rest of the family, grandma, the baby, everybody will be implicated and endangered. And this happened, just before I turned 15. You can see the agonies. It was awful. It was really awful.
Did you know at the time that Margot had gotten the call, or did you only know that after?
No, but it was assumed. Just everybody did. I mean, everybody who was of the refugee background got a call at the time. No, although we knew the Franks, they were not, as I said, they were not close friends, and so I didn't particularly keep track of the Frank family at that point. I kept track of Rudy, my boyfriend, and the kids in my class as far as I could, and that was it.
And of course, after Margot received that letter, that was the trigger.
That was the trigger. The Franks went into hiding the next day, actually, and that's all very explicitly explained in Anne's diary, so that, yeah. And, many of the kids, I have a picture still of my class, my 9th grade in the Jewish school. We were 16, and I think 4 of us survived of the 16. The rest were all killed in concentration camps, and they survived because they were either hiding or at one boy also had a similar history to my history, so he got out the legal way, so to speak. But, it came awfully close.
Is that background noise okay?
It's been there all along.
Yeah.
It goes on and off. Yeah. I mean, the way to deliver it is to live with it.
Yeah. Turn the heat. Is it the heat pump? Maybe?
No, it's the refrigerator.
Yeah, the fridge. Okay. All right. How are you doing, Laureen?
I'm fine. I'll have another drink.
We haven't talked much about Rudy. Tell us about Rudy, how you met him,
Okay.
and introduce Rudy.
Okay. Well, I mentioned my boyfriend, or Rudy, several times. Rudy was also from Frankfurt, not originally. He was born in Fürth, near Nuremberg. The Nussbaum family came to Amsterdam in 1938 and leased a little drugstore around the corner from us. Mr. Nussbaum had been a pharmacist, but he didn't have a license to run a pharmacy in the Netherlands, so a drugstore was the next best thing. And Rudy's immigration history is complex. Just make it very short. The family first went to Italy, and when Mussolini got instructions from Hitler to do something against the Jews, then again the refugee Jews were the first ones to be picked on. So that's when they left for the Netherlands. And when they settled in Amsterdam in our neighborhood, of course, all the many refugees who lived in the neighborhood frequented the drugstore, and everybody tried to help Mr. Nussbaum find his bearings. For my family, number one, my mother, I think, knew Mr. Nussbaum from a choir, but I'm not sure. He had a very nice voice, and he played the violin very well, and son Rudy played the piano, and the two families met over chamber music. My mother had a grand piano, and our house was always very, very hospitable, so we had trios and leader evenings, and always chamber music around. That's how Rudy got to visit frequently with my family, and pretty soon there was a friendship between really the four of us, my older sister Susie, Rudy, and then Rolf, Rudy's friend, the one that eventually, who had been to the Jewish farm and eventually was sent to Mauthausen and killed in 1941. Rudy did not have much of a school education because they had left Germany when he was 14, and he was looking around what he could do in Amsterdam to get independent as soon as possible. So he went to a rather unlikely place, to a ship engineering school, and was working to become a ship engineer. It was a 2-year program in which he did extremely well, but Rolf was picked up and sent packing just before Rudy did his final examination. And one of his traumatic experiences was, should he sit for the exam or should he go into hiding? Well, he missed the first day of the exam because he just couldn't make up his mind to go. And then, grace to the director of the school, he could catch up on the exam. He finished it, and the day he finished doing the exam, he had his bicycle packed and he went out in the countryside and went into hiding. Much earlier, that's July 1941, much earlier than most everybody else. And he was, well, even while he was doing the exam, he was living with this gentleman here. There's a picture, David de Jong, who was a painter and a writer. This man had there. And then eventually he landed in a peasant's house, really very, very small subsistence peasants. That's the house there in the picture. There he was hiding for a whole year. So he was hiding all the way through the war in different places. It would be too long to give all the details, but I always knew where he was. I always could take care of him by bringing him things. And for instance, in May of 1942, when we already had to wear the star, I took off my star early in the morning when there were no people in the street, went on the train, visited him, and bought him whatever could cheer him up, and generally took care of him. He was my responsibility. In August of the same year, when the big roundups and the deportations had started, I did not have the courage to take off my star anymore. It was too dangerous. So, I mean, within just 3 months, again, things had changed dramatically. It would have been too dangerous, and I would have endangered the whole family. So I didn't. So I did not look him up anymore then. But he had to leave where he was because some hidden Jews had been found, and there was a change in police force. A Nazi police, I think head of the police had been installed there, so it was not safe where he was. And by that time he had gotten in touch with the underground, and the underground found him a place to go into hiding near Amsterdam, in a suburb of Amsterdam, in Amstelveen. On the way there, he stopped by, saw his parents once more, and pleaded with them to go into hiding. They were still having their store and trying to sell as much as they could to have cash, to have something to finance going into hiding. And he really finally found a hiding place for him via the underground. And when people came to pick his parents up, they were gone. They had just been deported the night before. So that was very traumatic, very, very traumatic. Rudy and his mother were very close, and that was a terrible blow for him. But he stayed.
They were gone when they came to.
When the underground
made it
came to
into
pick them up, they were gone. They were not out of the country yet. They were
When
in
the
West.
underground came to pick them up, they were deported.
They were already deported. Yeah, the night before, they were deported, and they were sent to Westerbork, to the transit camp. Westerbork was a strange camp. There were thousands, tens of thousands of people. They had an infirmary, and the infirmary needed a pharmacist, so Mr. Nussbaum was for a while deferred to be the pharmacist for the infirmary. They were actually deferred from November 1942 till February of 1944. So that long they were in Westerbork, which was a boon because we could send them packages. They couldn't send much in way of communication. They were allowed, I think, one postcard every 2 weeks or so. So not enough to really be in touch. But Rudy's mother was pretty clever, and she befriended some people who were they were called the Couriers, who went back and forth between Westerbork and Amsterdam, because as long as the camp was still so huge, there was connection back and forth. And so the Couriers would bring us little notices. And of course it was a boon that my family was still where we used to be and above ground, so we were the liaison between Rudy and his parents for 15 months, really. And then as Westerbork was being emptied, there was no need anymore for the pharmacy, for the infirmary and for the pharmacy. So eventually they were sent to Theresienstadt, and then of course you are aware of the film Theresienstadt, and when it was beautified there in order to show the Danish and International Red Cross what a beautiful place it was, and in the project of beautifying Theresienstadt, thousands of people were sent to Auschwitz, including Rudy's parents. It was so crowded in Terezin that they needed to thin out the population. That's when they and many other Jews from the Netherlands were sent to Auschwitz and to the end, really. That's to say, it was the end of Rudy's father. Rudy's mother, who was very strong and very had a great vitality, managed to be sent with a contingent of younger Jewish women, and I don't know how much is known of that. They had a contingent of Jewish women sent from Auschwitz to Harburg, the harbor city of Hamburg, to clean up the rubble after the bombardments. They were rubble cleaners, and Rudy's mother made it to there. In August of 1944, 2 different Dutchmen sent us messages so we knew that Rudy's mother was still alive. Then she was sent to Bergen-Belsen, and she was liberated in Bergen-Belsen. Rudy saw her on a list, and she died after liberation because the British were so very, very ill prepared to take care of the people who all had typhus and were terribly undernourished. So he thought his mother would come back, but she didn't come back.
So she survived only to die just after liberation.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. The British were taking mercy on those people and fed them their K-rations, which was, of course, totally wrong.
So Westerbork, Auschwitz, Belsen, she was in many of the places that Anne Frank was.
Yeah.
Perhaps even at the same time.
She definitely must have been in Bergen-Belsen at the same time as Anne and Margot Frank. I don't know whether anything is known, whether Margot and Anne were also part of the contingent of women who were clearing the rubble. I don't think so. I think they were on a different transport.
How did Rudy keep in touch with you when he was in hiding? How did you know where he was?
Oh, I just made sure. I made sure. I mean, I visited him as long as I could, and only while I was wearing the star, and say from August.
Actually, you should start that again and repeat my question.
Okay, okay. I always stayed in touch with Rudy because I felt it was my responsibility to help him stay alive. So I visited him at a farmhouse in Gelderland, in Vierhouten, and knew the people where he was staying. Stayed here for 3 or 4 days, and when he then had to relocate and go to Amstelveen, while I was wearing the star, I could not visit him. I knew where he was, but I couldn't visit him. But we made agreements in the winter when it gets nice and dark. We could meet. Amstelveen is where he was about half an hour bicycling from where we lived, so I could walk star and all, or maybe I took the star off at night, I don't know, just maybe 10 minutes, and he could come by bicycle, and we could just have a short visit, exchange whatever. I could give him books or whatever he wanted, and then he would go back. But once I got rid of the star in January of 1943, then I could bicycle again, and then I could look him up and take care of things. By that time, my school, that's something that's kind of interesting. When we could leave the Jewish school, my sister went back to the school where she and I had started. She was in her final year, and she had to work mighty hard to do the final examination. I opted to go to a girls' school because Margot had gone to a girls' school, and I wanted to go to the same school, still hoping that maybe somehow somebody would make a lady out of me. Who knows? That was the one reason. And the other reason was that the boys in my class in the Jewish school, boys of 15, 16, I found so childish, so unbearably childish. I had, of course, Rudy, who was 5 years older. I just couldn't stand those kids. I just wanted to get away from them, and so a girls' school seemed to be the right place for me, and it was a very good school. And
So Margot Frank was a real role model for you.
yeah, Margot was really a role model for me.
Can you say that?
Margot was, I mentioned that before in the play reading, the German play reading, that Margot had always been a model for me because of her ladylike, well-balanced demeanor. I was not ladylike and not well-balanced, and I thought, well, maybe a girls' school will give me the polish that I obviously lack, and so that was the reason why it was one of the 2 reasons why I wanted to go to the girls' school. The other reason being that I didn't like the boys of my own age. I found them singularly childish and impossible, really.
What was it like in January 1943 when you were able to take the star off and live openly?
Well, when we were somehow, and I marvel at that sometime, we had a feeling that our case would be decided favorably, because it was a good case, really. It was very hard to prove that my mother had a Jewish father. And so we were always very hopeful. The only scary thing was, would the decision come in time? You know, I mean, deferments always lasted a limited amount of time, and then it stopped. Did somebody knock at the door? No. Okay. Deferments were limited, so we were holding our breath, but it came just in time so my sister could finish her high school, which I think was great, because it would have been awful if she had yet lost another year. And for me it was great that it happened when it happened, because I felt free to visit Rudy and take care of his needs and whatever was going on. Also, and that was terribly important to the whole family, we could again shop wherever we wanted to shop, whenever we wanted to shop, and make packages to send to Westerbork, not only to Rudy's parents, but to countless friends. We sent sometimes up to a dozen packages a week, just to keep people, make their life a little bit more bearable, whether it be soap or dried fruit or whatever we could scrounge up, we would send. And that we could only do easily once we could use our bicycles again and once we could shop again. So it came in good time, not only for my family of 5, but for all the other things that we were involved in as a family also. And of course my father was sort of protected by being the Jewish part of a mixed family. He was called up to do menial labor, but then another bad thing of the past turned out to be a blessing, just like my great-grandmother's bigotry was a blessing. So my father had contracted TBC during World War I, tuberculosis, and he had a big scar on his lung. And so X-ray showed that he might be contagious still, and so that was his way of getting out of forced labor. Otherwise, he would have had to do forced labor in day camp, and he didn't have to do that. So we really, as a family, were extremely fortunate.
Your father still had to wear the star?
Oh yeah, my father still had to wear the star. Of course, he was Jewish. Yes.
But he was safe from deportation?
He was not, well, as I said, a Jewish man in mixed marriages, there was, for a while, the sterilization was an option, or you had to go into work in day labor camps, and that was forestalled because of his tuberculosis.
Wasn't the Mr. what was his name, Kohler, the one in hiding with the Franks, wasn't he in a mixed marriage?
He had a relationship with Charlotte.
Yeah.
Yeah, but they were not married, number
Not
one,
married.
because they couldn't marry. There was a certain point in Germany where you couldn't, after 35, you couldn't marry mixed. Also, there were mixed marriages and mixed marriages. With children was different from mixed marriages without children. Mixed marriages where the man was Jewish was different from mixed marriages where the woman was Jewish. There were all kinds of, fine points, which I don't think you want me to go into.
And it was inconsistent, too, from what was the rules in Germany or Austria or other places?
Say that again?
Was there wasn't consistency then with what the Nazis were applying in the Netherlands?
It was not totally consistent. I mentioned that before. Mixed marriages in Germany, if children of a mixed marriage had received a Jewish education, they were considered Jewish and they had to wear a star. In the Netherlands, that was not the case. And there might have been other subtle differences, but that's one I know for sure.
So tell more about the responsibility you felt being Rudy's link to the world.
Yeah, I would like to go back. You asked me how it was to be without a star. Of course, I had to go back to a public school, a girls' school, and the kids, the other girls, looked me over, top to bottom, and but accepted me. And it turned out that there was at least, I remember, one other half-Jewish girl in my class, a girl with whom I had been to elementary school, who recognized me, I recognized her. There were also a few Nazi kids in the class, and they were ostracized. So it was quite clear that the sentiment was not in favor of the Nazis, and so I was made relatively welcome. I had a small kind of traumatic experience that spring when 10th, 11th, and 12th grade of our girls' school went on a 3-day camping trip. It wasn't really camping, but a field trip. We lived in kind of barracks where we had bunk beds, 3 on top of each other. And I remember all of a sudden it hit me and I started crying tremendously because I was thinking of all my Jewish classmates who also were in bunk beds, but not for fun, but because there was no choice. So all of a sudden it really hit me how unfair it all was and how impossible it all was. That was a very traumatic experience.
So you're referring to your Jewish classmates being in bunks?
Well, of course, in Westerbork, we knew there were bunk beds in Westerbork. We knew that, yeah. And we didn't know what happened to them later on, but we knew that they did not have a jolly time like we had. We were there to walk and to be out in the country and to have barbecues and have a good time, basically.
So on one hand, you would feel somewhat liberated by not taking the star up.
Oh, but did we feel liberated? My goodness, yes. We kept a family diary, and not yet in January of '43, but starting December '43, and on January 19th of the next year, it was my mother's turn to write a diary, and she wrote down that we celebrated the shedding of our stars a year ago. So yes, we certainly knew that it was our salvation. There was no doubt about it. Yeah.
Did your father stay inside most of the time at this point?
No, he didn't have to stay inside. No, he tried to do some business deals as long as he could, but it was getting more and more difficult to make a living for him. Luckily, there was some money in the family, and my grandmother was was very frugal and didn't part easily with her money, but she would give loans, so we managed. Yeah.
But it was still safe for him to walk the streets of Amsterdam with the
Oh
Jewish
yeah,
stuff.
yeah, sure, because he had the right papers. No, he would not have been easily rounded up arbitrarily. It could have happened, of course, but I think there was sort of an unofficial warning system that he would stay away when things got hot, so to speak. Yeah.
And was it difficult for you as a child of, you were what, 14?
At this time, when the star went off, I was 15.
15, to
Yeah.
have the responsibility of being Rudy's connection to the world.
Sure, it was very difficult. I sometimes thought I wouldn't even wish it on my enemies to grow up with a close relationship with a man 5 years older and go to the transition from child to teenager and adult. It was very difficult, yes, it was very difficult. But I wouldn't have given up on it just for my own sake, but it came to a dramatic point. Rudy tried to escape to Spain. He got illegal papers, and he was posing as a Dutch technician who was in charge of procuring vital parts for German submarines. Long story. So he had false papers which allowed him to travel on the German army trains, no less, all the way to southern France, where he was supposed to get in touch with the underground, the Marquis, and get across the Pyrenees to Spain and then to Portugal and join the war effort on the British side. Well, he made it to the Spanish border, but it turned out that there had been a raid and one link was missing, and he realized that if he didn't get the right people of the underground, he had to return, because his French was school French, but not the local French. I mean, he would have stuck out like a sore thumb. So he managed to find a typewriter to fill out a new set of falsified papers, and came back to Amsterdam. And the whole trip was no longer than 10 days. But that I found very traumatic. I was 16 by that time, and really feeling, hallelujah, now I'm just a 16-year-old girl. Now I can just grow up and do what 16-year-old girls do, do my schoolwork and spend time with the family and with friends. And here he was again, dependent on me, and I know it was hard. I really felt, golly, I would have loved for him to get across the border and be in freedom and have my own freedom for a few years. But we managed. We did. So I'm grateful that he didn't get caught. I mean, this whole it's all written down, but his experience on the train and so on. It's very interesting, but that would take us too far afield to talk about that.
Did you know about other friends or acquaintances or neighbors who were in hiding? Did you know about it at the time?
Sure, I did know that other people were in hiding too. The parents of a friend of ours were in hiding in Amsterdam, and since she was also in hiding, I was the one who visited them weekly and bought them some flowers and some whatever we could scrounge up to help them. Yes, I had a family. Besides Rudy, I had an elderly couple that I was more or less in charge of, close to my school. They lived in an empty apartment because whenever a Jewish family was deported, the apartments were totally emptied and the furniture was sent to Germany for German families who were bombed out and needed furniture. So they lived in a totally empty apartment, and I knew where it was. I visited them. Yes, these were the only ones that were also my responsibility. Otherwise, of course, I know, of course, that our friend was in hiding, and once in a while you heard of somebody, but we really didn't want to know. I mean, we really studiously did not want to know more than was our responsibility, because you could be apprehended and tortured and spill the beans, and who would want to do that? That would have been impossible.
Do you have any specific memories of friends or neighbors being captured or deported?
Well, of course, I mean, these roundups happened all the time. In fact, my mother and my sister and I were rounded up on August the 6th of 1942. Luckily, my father was not home. We were rounded up and processed in a former high school, which was now the headquarters of the Gestapo. And this was, Margot and my sister got their call to report on the 5th of July, so this is 6th of August. That's pretty soon thereafter. So there were still many people then rounded up in our neighborhood who had some reason to claim deferment. A greengrocer who needed to serve his Jewish clientele, the teacher who still had to teach Jewish children, the doctor who still had to see to his patients. So the deferment was the name of the game. And so my mother, by that time, had already her case pending and had the necessary papers. So eventually it was her turn to plead her case, and she showed that she was really unjustly classified as a Jew, that the case was pending, blah, 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 blah. And just as she got the okay that we could leave, my grandmother, who was smaller than I am and very feisty, came marching up, and she would have given those officers a piece of her mind. She felt as a non-Jew she could do that, but it wasn't necessary. We were let go after several hours, and we could go home. And we were not the only ones, but not nearly all the people were let go either. So this was just one of those roundups. And these roundups happened all the time. I mean, in Amsterdam it's very easy. You pull up the bridges and people are caught in a neighborhood. You don't even need much military personnel. It's just very, very simple.
And was it very scary, very terrifying?
Of course it was scary. Well, again, we had this I think this charm that we thought our case is so good, we will probably come through. But it was no fun to be on a green SS truck and be deported to, or not deported, but transported to headquarters. No, it was certainly no fun.
Did some of your friends or neighbors report willingly, and did you get a chance to say goodbye to them?
When we were rounded up? No.
In other times, when they were sent or told to go to Western War? Or did people only go when they were rounded up?
Well, they were all, yes, but we had very dear neighbors who somehow had to move to another neighborhood, which was also more or less a Jewish neighborhood, and they got a call. I think this neighborhood, they were being notified that everybody had to report at 9 o'clock in the morning, I don't remember. And so this was after we got rid of our stars, so I remember biking over and helping them. They lived on the 3rd floor, carrying their luggage down, and seeing the long line of people getting ready to be shipped off. Sure, that was very much part of life, yes. Yes. And I pleaded with them why not go into hiding, and they said, well, we are elderly. I think elderly at that time was maybe around 60, definitely not older. And we have had a good life. We don't want to endanger anybody else just to save our hides. So they didn't even want to consider to go into hiding. And besides, it would not be easy. They were also refugees, and as I mentioned before, for refugees in general, it was much harder to find hiding places because they didn't have the connections that the Dutch Jews had, who had lived for generations in the Netherlands and had neighbors and friends and intermarriages and all kinds of things. So they had a much easier time to go into hiding.
Are there any other stories, episodes, memories of these specific years that you think would be worth retelling or interesting?
I don't think so. Sorry. At the very end of it all, my father ceremoniously burnt his yellow star. He did that as a ceremonious action. I remember that. I often have thought the story of the Frank family, how very, very difficult it would have been for Miep to keep them provided with food. I mean, the hunger winter in Holland, in the big cities, was really dreadful. People died by the thousands from starvation. And the things we did to stay alive that winter, and I mean, not as Jewish people, but as people in general, we cut down trees, people demolished empty Jewish apartments to get to the wood, to burn the wood, because we had no electricity and no gas for a whole winter. And I don't know whether you can imagine living in a city without electricity and without gas. It was terrible. Schools were not heated. We had only a few hours of school in our coats. And the hunger winter was very traumatic for everybody. And how people who had Jews hiding fed them through this starvation period is a miracle that they really could do it. It was hard enough for everybody else. My younger sister, who was in a going spell, she was 14 at the end of the war, turning 15, fainted from hunger. You know, I mean, it was that bad, really. And so I went twice on a trip to provide food for the family. We exchanged linen and clothing for food, and I went all the way to the farmhouse where Rudy had been hiding to exchange things, barter really for food and to help the family. And we dug fodder beets out of the ground and washed them in the bathtub. We had water, mercifully only one day without water, but we had water all the time. And so we had fodder beets, we ate tulip bulbs. Horrible. So how people did who had hiders, I don't know, but they deserve an extra credit for feeding those people through.
Was it better for Rudy because he was in the countryside?
Rudy was outside of the city, which was always better than the big city. And well, they were all starving. I mean, everybody lost weight, but it was still not in the big city. It was the big cities like Rotterdam, The Hague, and Amsterdam that were worse off. Once you had, lived surrounded by farmers, sometimes you could get a cup of milk or something, one egg, whatever.
Did you know about it? Did you hear about it when the Frank family was betrayed and arrested in 1944?
We had no ideas that the Franks were in Amsterdam. We had believed the story that they might have left the country, and we liked to believe that, but it was impossible to keep track of all of our friends. I mean, everybody was gone, and so the Franks did not take a particular position within all those acquaintances that we had, and some people surfaced right after the war, to our surprise, and some it took longer. So when Otto Frank came back, I think in June, early June of, maybe late May, but I think early June of 1945, of course we were elated to see him back, and it was good to hear that he thought that his two daughters had survived too. He knew that Edith had not survived, and we wanted to believe with him that they had survived. But then came the trickle of concentration camp inmates that came back once the trains rode again. We didn't have any trains from September 1945 till after liberation. There was the railroad personnel struck on behalf of the Dutch government in exile, and the Germans then proceeded to dismantle our whole beautiful railroad net. So it was terrible. Lots of pictures of that too. But anyway, so once people could use trains again and come back, then survivors of concentration camps came on trains, and there was a period in June, July of 1945 when Otto Frank and Rudy went together to the Amsterdam railroad station. He had a picture of Margot and Anne, and Rudy had a picture of his mother asking survivors, have you seen these girls, have you seen this woman? And that's how they finally found out that none of the three would come back. They did this together, which bonded them very much, and that was probably one of the reasons that Otto Frank officiated as our witness at our wedding in 1947, because the two men bonded so well. The other reason was that I had adopted him a little bit because I knew he was missing his girls, so I tried to be there on their birthdays and so on. So, but that was only after.
What are your memories of liberation?
Liberation, the first bit of it was exhilarating. We were liberated by the Canadians. We jumped on their tanks, went clear across the city from one end to the other. My Canadians were French-speaking Canadians, so my English didn't help me much. I had to dig out my French, but okay. So there was this great sense of exhilaration. Then, very soon, we found out what had happened in the concentration camps, and we saw the trickle of people who came out of hiding, people who had nothing else but the clothes on their back and no place to go to. My mother put up whoever she could, but that, I mean, first the people who came out of hiding, pale and drawn, and most often not complete families, but they had lost one or two members of the family. And then came the news from the concentration camps, and that was in many ways harder to take than the whole war, because now we couldn't hope anymore. During the war, we could keep hoping that people would come back. Now we knew they wouldn't come back. And I remember I was a senior in high school at that point. Oh, I didn't mention, I will mention that later. And so the best way for me to cope was to cram for the final examination, which is a countrywide examination and very strict. And then in the course of July, we learned that my class, countrywide, would get their diploma without the examination. And everybody was cheering, and I was crestfallen because I had hoped to be excused for a while from real life and just be a schoolgirl for a change, which is something I have in common with Anne Frank. She wanted to be back in school all the time and talked about it in her diary and so forth. Yeah, that was a letdown for me, but the first months after the end of the war were awful because then the whole truth descended upon us. What I didn't mention, but it was kind of curious, during the hunger winter when we had no electricity, the last 6 months of the war, 8 months of the war, Rudy was hiding with us because he had been outside of Amsterdam, no longer in Amstelveen, but at the other end of the city. And there was talk about the possibility that there would be a siege of Amsterdam and he would be on the outside and we would be on the inside. At that point, the danger for Jews to be picked up and sent to wherever was minimal because no trains were running anymore. So my parents said, okay, why doesn't he come here? So he was hiding at our place. He built a beautiful hiding place, and it was a boon that he was around because my father was not very technical. If there was anybody technical in the family, my mother would have done better, but Rudy was by far the best. So he set up a bicycle in the living room, like an exercise bicycle, put on 2 generators, and that's how we generated electricity. And since I had to read a lot for my final examination, at that point I still thought I had to do final examination, I was sitting on that bike and pedaling my heart out and reading For instance, Madame Curie, en français, the book written by her daughter, the biography of Madame Curie written by Eve Curie, and other books. I was sitting on a bicycle. So when I came to University House and somebody was going to show me the standing bicycle down there, I said, I've done mine. Not for me. You won't get me on the standing bicycle. I've done my pedaling for the rest of my life. It was just a kind of a fun thing.
It's a very Dutch thing to have a
Yeah,
bicycle.
yeah.
So Rudy came and hid with you in Amsterdam.
The last 8 months he was in Amsterdam. Yeah. Yeah.
And were you boyfriend, girlfriend at this point?
Oh yes, we were boyfriend, girlfriend, but he had a bed in the dining room, which was a strange place. But there, we had 3 built-in closets, and he made a beautiful hiding place in one of the closets. That was a good place for him. And my mother adopted Rudy with a vengeance. She was really happy to have a big boy in the house, and so he was very, very much made welcome. But my mother was an extremely generous person anyway. And my father went along and saw that was probably the right thing to do. And so,
Do you have any specific memories of survivors of the camps returning and telling and hearing their stories firsthand?
yes, the kindergarten teacher of my sons, Annie, was a survivor of Auschwitz. And it was very difficult. We became good friends, really good friends, much more than acquaintances. But it was very hard. You knew it was always in the background of their mind, but when could you ask and when could you not ask? It was very delicate, and I don't think we did very well. We tried. In the beginning, we asked very little because it just seemed too painful. Another one was Rudy's cousin Ilse, who survived in Theresienstadt, but with her you couldn't talk at all. She just closed off. She couldn't. She was the only survivor of her family, and heavily traumatized. So these are certainly 2 people I have. They both went into painting. I have 2 paintings from Ilse and 2 from Annie in the hall. But these are the people that I knew best. Of course, there were others too. We had neighbors. Our neighbors on the 2nd floor. We lived on the 3rd floor. The neighbors on the 2nd floor moved during the war. They were a mixed family, half Jewish. And their apartment was empty, so after the war, a young couple was allotted this apartment, and they were both survivors. Sorry.
So let's discuss again if you could retell the end of the war, the Otto Frank's return, and your association with him after the war.
Well, Otto Frank, as far as I remember, returned late May or early June via Odessa and down to the Mediterranean to Marseille. And of course, we were extremely happy to see him back. At that point, he knew that Edith had perished, really died in Auschwitz, not gassed, but died. And that the 2 girls had been sent to Bergen-Belsen. And since Bergen-Belsen was not an annihilation camp per se, he was hoping that they would have survived and that he would see them soon afterwards. And Rudy knew that his mother was also in Bergen-Belsen. And so Otto Frank and Rudy went together daily to the railroad station where survivors came straggling in and asked them, holding pictures of the 2 girls and of Rudy's mother, asking, do you know these women, do you know these girls, what can you tell us about them? And so that's how they each found out that no, there wouldn't be any reunion anymore.
How did they find out?
Rudy was told by somebody who knew his mother, I think. I'm not entirely sure. Also, later on, there were new lists. Rudy's mother had been on a list of liberated people, which was not true for the Frank girls. With regard to the Frank girls, it was a woman, Brilleslapper, I forget her first name, but that's all written down in books, who knew the Frank girls in Bergen-Belsen. I knew that they had died, and she told Otto Frank. Very traumatic, as you can imagine. And it was only after that was accepted as the final truth that Pries gave the manuscripts of Anne's writings to Otto. And then I remember quite distinctly Otto with a kind of manila folder under his arm coming to see my parents and also other friends, not just my parents, and wondering out loud whether or not he should publish the book. There was something that he felt Anne wanted, but should he really? And of course everybody at the time said, yes, you should. It was very hard to find a publisher. Nobody wanted to touch it. Everybody wanted to look forward. Nobody wanted to look backward. It took him quite a while before he found Bert Bakker, the publishing house, to publish the book, which is now exactly 70 years ago in June of this year. And that was also the same year, 1947, that Rudy and I got married, and we invited Otto to be, you don't call it best man in Dutch, but Rudy's best man, okay, partly because he and Rudy had shared this dismal experience of being at a station together looking for their loved ones, and partly because I had made sure that I bought a little something on Anne's birthday, and generally tried to keep in touch with Otto Frank, because I thought, well, maybe one young person is better than no young person in his life. So that was the idea.
Did you get a chance to read any parts of the diary before it was published?
I did not read anything of the diary before it was published. I wasn't even consulted. I mean, you have to remember I was 17 at the time, turning 18 in August, and people of that young age were not consulted. I was not counted. In fact, that has been something that later on I have held against Otto Frank, that Daddy Knows Best was very much part of that society. And the way he went about publishing Anne's diary by mixing two versions, that has not sat well with me, because I'm too much of a literature person to condone messing in anybody's text. So, however fond I am of Otto Frank, he did not do right by his daughter's writing in my book.
Did he talk about what was in the diaries before it was published?
We knew that the diary was written while Anne was in hiding, and he mentioned that he had learned things about her that he had never known, but otherwise no. And of course, I must confess, I wasn't all that anxious to read how it was to be in hiding. I knew all about that, you know. That was no news to me. For me, it was much more interesting to see a text written by such a young person, because that's rare. And when I found out after Otto Frank died that Anne had really started to rewrite her original text, that's when my literary interest got aroused.
So when did you first read the diary?
I first read the diary in 1947. I have a copy of the diary of 1947, sure. I read it right then and there.
And what's your memories of reading it for the first time?
My memory of reading it is, as I mentioned, no revelation about how it is to be in hiding. I mean, I knew all that. I knew that when I visited Rudy and somebody rang the doorbell that we had to freeze, that you couldn't move. I knew all that, so that was not important. For me, it was important to see how a person that young finds the words to express herself and what's going on. That was always the important thing. The story of the hiding as such was one of 100 stories, you know, but didn't have any special.
Did you have any revelations about Anne as a girl and her character?
But even then, I don't think that I was particularly spellbound by Anne as a person. I know that's the emphasis for many people. For me, it's Anne the writer that has been, from the beginning, the fascinating angle of this phenomenon, Anne Frank, that she wrote so consciously and so conscientiously. That I thought was special, very special.
So when you read it for the first time, did you have any idea that it would be so popular?
We had no idea that Anne would be an icon after a few decades. No idea. And by the way, it took pretty long. Yes, there was the English translation, and from the English the Japanese translation, and pretty soon 55 translations. When we looked up Otto Frank in 1969, I think there were already 55 translations that he had in his bookshelves. But it still did not really reach as wide a public as now. Now when I correspond with people at the Anne Frank house in Amsterdam, the lines get bigger and bigger every year. It's amazing. It seems to snowball.
And did your relationship with Otto continue?
Well, we visited him and we corresponded, and I wrote to him after I got my PhD, which was relatively late in life, that I would like to look at his diary as a piece of literature. Would he have any objections? And he gave me the go-ahead and wrote me a very nice letter, which I dutifully deposited at the Anne Frank house in Amsterdam. So they have the original, and so I did. So I wrote quite a number of articles about Anne Frank's diaries. Some of them were published even by the Anne Frank house in Amsterdam, and others in other literary books and so on. So yes, I spent quite some time looking at the way she went about her writing and trying to bring that to the foreground.
So how long did you and Rudy stay in the Netherlands?
Rudy and I left the Netherlands in 1957 for good, but there is a prehistory to that. Rudy got his PhD December 1954, and then we went for 3 months to live in Liverpool, England, and then for a year in Bloomington, Indiana, where he did his postdoc year, and then yet for another year in Geneva, Switzerland. And only then did we decide that we would take the family and move to the United States. By that time, it was 1957. So we did not come to this country as refugees. We came to this country because Rudy was a nuclear physicist, and 1957 was the year of Sputnik. So nuclear physicists, yay, come, Whereas 20 years earlier, another Jew, no. Which is pretty ironic, And the same, of course, is true. We loved the Alps, and for many years we would go every other year to Switzerland to hike in the Alps. And there too, they had to look at our American passport. But we are the same people that we would not be let in, 20 years earlier. That shows you something of the contradictions in our whole setup.
Tell about the fate of some of your other relatives from the war.
Well, I do not really know much because I don't think my parents delved very deep, but I know that my father's 2 older brothers survived in their own, well, no, I'm not sure whether they survived in their own house or not. They survived anyway. One I didn't even know, but my older sister told me was also mixed married. I didn't know that Aunt Elizabeth was not Jewish. Nobody had ever told me. And the children of these brothers all survived. But my father's sisters, who had married German Jewish husbands and who came to France as refugees, they were rounded up and they were sent to concentration camps. But I do not know in which camp they died. I really don't know. And my father's mother died before the roundup, so she died still on French soil, which was merciful, at least. Other relatives, I don't know. I have not been in touch with anybody any farther away. All my cousins on father's side survived either in France or in England or farther away.
Any other incidents, events, or stories from the post-war period that you think are particularly interesting?
Well, it's maybe a little interesting how we acquired our American citizenship. That's sort of typical for Rudy and me. This was 1963, I think, when the U.S. had military bases in Germany, and they were also going to station nuclear weapons in Germany. And there was a protest, no German fingers on the nuclear trigger. That was the slogan. And Rudy and I participated in this demonstration. Obviously, we still had a very strong distrust of anything German. It took us a long time before we would ever talk German in public, although we spoke it fluently, obviously. And so one of Rudy's colleagues said the next day, "How come, Rudy, that you were in demonstration? You are not even a citizen." Oh, said Rudy, "We can remedy that." Next day we applied for citizenship, got it without a hitch, very fast, and actually did not. I was affiliated with the Quaker meeting at the time, teaching Sunday school even, and so we affirmed. We did not swear anything. We did not say that we would bear arms for the United States. We just said we were conscientious objectors, but we wanted to be citizens, to fully participate in the political life of the country. And we had a wonderful federal judge in Portland by the classical name of Solomon. Judge Solomon couldn't be any better. And we became citizens. And he also asked our two sons at the time, the oldest one was 14 and the other one was 10, whether they were raised as conscientious objectors, and they said yes. So when the Vietnam War came around, our oldest son had an easy time being recognized as a CO, which is kind of interesting sequel.
But you were German citizens up to this point?
No, we were not German citizens. We were stateless first for many years, and we got the Dutch citizenship early 1952, finally. It took very long. The Dutch took their time. So no, we had not been German citizens since 1941, when Hitler took away the citizenship of all German Jews who had left the country. We were not German, no. And nothing could be worse than what happened to Rudy when he showed up for his papers in Amsterdam after the war. I had said, "Why don't you keep your false name?" He said, no, he wanted to get his own name back. Okay, fine. And then the official bureaucrat said, "Oh, now you're German again." And Rudy almost blew his stack. Absolutely not. I'm not German. I don't want to be German. I will never be German again. It was a big row. We had strong emotional aversion against anything German, which did not sit very well with the fact that I got a PhD in German language and literature. So that was certainly a paradox. But that's over now.
Did your family ever go back to Germany? Did your parents?
It took us very long. Rudy had a year as a guest professor in Groningen in the Netherlands in 1968-69, and it was then that we felt, it's now 25 years after the war, 24 years after the war, it's time that we confront ourselves. But we went with gritted teeth, really, very, very tense. But that's when we visited Bergen-Belsen and Auschwitz and Dachau and Mauthausen. But see, we were still awfully tense, and I remember for Rudy, a big breakthrough came. He was giving talks about his subject in nuclear physics in different universities in Germany, and in Holland he had always given the talks in English because that was the language in which he did his work, although his Dutch was perfectly fine. But in Germany he noticed that people did not really understand English quite as well as the Dutch do. The Dutch are famously, like the Danes, very good in languages. So he fought with himself and finally got himself to do his talk in German. He described it, one voice said, but it's your mother tongue, you speak it fluently. The other boy said, yeah, but I've never done any physics in German. And it went back and forth and back and forth. And finally he decided he should do it. And it felt like a liberation to him. His audience might have appreciated it. His German colleagues, the ones that had invited him, and with whom we were on a very good footing, helped out when there was a technical term missing. But by and large, he felt that he had overcome one of the emotional obstacles that one better not carry till the end of life. So that was the first big step for him. And then later on in the 80s, when he was much more interested in the health effects of nuclear power stations and talked about that, he was invited to speak in Germany, and he did that in German, and was invited by a German family, younger people who were born after the war, and these people now are our best German friends. So we now have friends in Germany, and I can speak German in Germany without feeling totally discombobulated, so I can do it. But still, it's very emotional when I get to an airport in Portland or here, and I hear people talk Dutch. More likely than not, I will sidle up to them and say, "Hi, I speak Dutch too." If I hear people talk German, I don't have any need to cozy up. That's still a difference, which shows you how deep these things go. Really.
Do you have any messages or statements if you were, say, a student was to watch this in 10 or 20 years and you wanted to, or this testimony was to be shown, kind of your personal message or that you would like to impart?
I think as an old person, and I'll be 90 this summer, I really leave this earth very, very disappointed. Right after the war, there was such a tremendous feeling of internationalism, the United Nations, unified Europe, no more of these atrocities, no more wars, and starting maybe with the Korean War, but I wasn't very much part of that, we were still in Europe, but starting with the Vietnam War and from there down to Afghanistan and Iraq and whatever else we are perpetrating. I think it's dismal. I think mankind has not learned from our terrible experiences, and I'm very disappointed, and I feel somewhat guilty that I have not been able to use my life to help avert what looks like a very tragic course that mankind is going on, particularly now here in this country. So no, I don't have any hopeful message except that one has to keep trying. That's all. That's what I'm doing, with not too much success, but yet keep trying.
Keep trying.
Yeah. Not much.
Anything else you'd like to add in general?
No, I don't. Well, it's something that we observed during the war, and that was also reinforced by reading about this period, when the chips are down and things get very terrible. We often say, well, I lucked out, my family definitely lucked out. But we find that by and large, if surviving is important to you, and it is to most people, it takes a combination of two things. Number one is luck, which you cannot always steer. Most of the time you cannot. But the other thing is awareness. You have to be alert and aware of what the possibilities are. I think it's the combination of these two that you will find time and again when you talk to survivors. They were lucky something worked in their direction, but they were also alert and seized the chance. So you cannot do much about luck, but you can do something about awareness. So be aware. This would be another message.
Good. Well, thank you, Laureen. If we have time, Dawn, just a couple more minutes. I know this is your favorite part, but I think in the retelling of your relationship with the Franks, it was kind of all, if we were to edit that down, it sometimes is very much, it isn't, just give us a few kind of complete phrases and statements that stand on their own,
Yeah, okay. Well, when we came to Amsterdam in 1936, there were already several refugee families settled in Amsterdam, amongst them the family of Anne Frank. Otto Frank, his wife Edith, his older daughter Margot, and younger daughter Anne. My parents had known the Franks vaguely in Frankfurt. We came from the same city. But we moved into the same neighborhood where the Franks lived, and I always have the idea, although I'm not sure, that Mr. Frank helped my father establish himself in the business world in the Netherlands. Sorry. The neighborhood where we lived, the river neighborhood, was one where many Jewish refugee families were housed. There were quite a number of elementary schools in our neighborhood. So Margot Frank, who is 1 year older than I was, she was born in February 1926, went to a different school, a regular elementary school. And Anne, who is 2 years younger than I am, born in June of 1929, went to a Montessori school. There were many Montessori schools in Amsterdam. They were part of the public school system. We did not, I do not remember seeing much of them the very first year that we were in Amsterdam, but pretty soon Otto Frank and others, my father included, established a new liberal Jewish community, and the Franks were members, and my father, of course, and that's where I saw the Frank girls on the high holidays, and that's where I saw Mrs. Frank in action on the more cheerful holidays like Simchas Torah, and that was all for the first few years. Then this liberal Jewish synagogue started religious education. It's not really Sunday school, it was Wednesday afternoons, but Margot Frank, my older sister Susie, and I would bicycle together to the religious education, which was about 10 minutes, 15 minutes away from where we lived. Anne was too young, and my younger sister was too young, so it was just the three of us. That's where I got to see Margot every week, and I admired her from the beginning because she was such a well-composed, wonderful young lady. Then came the German occupation in May of 1940 and of the Netherlands, and from then on Jewish families were very much more put back on their own devices. The effort to become part of the Dutch society stopped more or less, certainly for the parents, not for us kids. We were very much part of the Dutch society, but for the parents. But then we were being excluded from all possible things that were relaxing culturally or physically, sports, museums, concerts, and so on. So families were more or less put to their own creativity and their own devices to do something worthwhile. And at that point, Mr. Frank and my father and others got together and devised the idea of having the older kids, the teenagers, read the German classics once or twice a month. I don't remember exactly how frequently it was. And they found a lady, refugee woman who needed some income very badly. She was a journalist and couldn't write in Dutch. So Anneliese Schütz was the woman who taught that course, and they read the German classics, alternating in the houses of different families, in the apartments of different families. And whenever they came to do the reading at our place, I was allowed to sit in and read along and listen. And that's again where I observed Margot and liked her very much and took her as a model. And I only got to know a little better a little later, half a year later, when we set up a play, The Princess with the Nose, which was being mounted in my parents' apartment. As far as I remember, Anne was the princess, the main person, I had bought a play from Germany, and so I was more or less in charge. I was 2 years older, which is quite a bit when you are 11 and 13. And so well, I was even 14, okay, 14, 12 and 14. And so we rehearsed and then produced The Princess with the Nose, and I could observe Anne, but did not spend more time on her than on the other kids. Anne and her friend Sanna were 2 years younger than I, but the rest of the crew of the play were 3 years younger, the age of my younger sister, and I had my hands full watching them because their German, the play was in German, had deteriorated and was already sounding very Dutch. And so that's where my attention went. So I did observe Anne. She certainly was lively and a quick study, but my attention was more on the younger children. By that time, we had to go to Jewish schools, and my older sister and I used a streetcar, which we boarded at a terminal, and the Frank girls, Margot and Anne, would, with a whole slew of other children, board two stops further into the city. And I remember Anne always being surrounded by a whole flock of girls, she in the middle, talking away and amusing and entertaining everybody. But these were, I guess, my main memories of young Anne at the beginning of the war. The rest came after the war, when Otto Frank came to my parents with a sheaf of papers under his arm, which were Anne's written diaries, and asked their advice whether or not he should publish what Anne had written. And then when the book was finally published in 1947, I got a copy. I still have the book of 1947, and I remember reading it. And at that point, I was much more fascinated by Anne, the writer, than by what she went through in hiding, because what people went through in hiding I knew well enough. I didn't need Anne to study that. I knew it. Yeah.
Beautiful.
Good.
Wow, this is a great. I really,